Yes, welcome to Auto Layout. Make friends with it, you'll need it. What I'm trying to do tonight is just give you an overlay out of what Auto Layout is, how it works, and what its little quirks are. So basically, Auto Layout is a set of ways for the computer to work out where things are supposed to go on the screen. And it describes the position of interface items in a particular language. You've got three ways of setting up Auto Layout. You can do it in Interface Builder and just add constraints there. You can use the visual format language, which is a bit like ASCII on steroids, or you can just do everything purely in code. And a lot of the time you will want to do some mixture of that. So there's no problem mixing things up. And I have heard something to the contrary tonight, but Apple's guidelines actually say you should not be shipping apps to the App Store either using the old style format or using the interface builder placeholders. If you leave those in, your app will be rejected. So basically, make friends with Auto Layout. Yes, let's start. Before Auto Layout, there was darkness, actually something called struts and strings, which may still sometimes be mentioned, but which has been deprecated for a while. And you did have a lot of set frame. So in 2014, when I first started looking into how do I move things around, I came across tutorials, I tried out the code, translated it to Swift, and it worked. And yes, that was all very well for a certain amount of time. It's actually reasonably straightforward as long as you're looking at one single window. So you say, where do I want it? You say, okay, so if I want to manipulate the window, expand it, what do I want? And then you work out the sizes and you do that. Unfortunately, Noctopus says no. Next one is slightly more complicated. It's actually an awful lot more complicated. And once you start going down that rabbit hole, you find there's an awful lot of things you need to remember. Do I put it here? Do I put it there? Which one do I animate? Can you actually animate a constraint? It's not easy, and yes, I apologize for that. Auto Layout challenges, and you see there are quite a few. It can be confusing. It has an awful lot of options, which means that you can do an awful lot of things, but when you're just starting out, they can be a little overwhelming. And then you get into the fact you have ambiguous layouts, you think you've described everything, and you run it, and suddenly your views disappear, or they appear all over the place, and the next time you run it, they appear somewhere else. You've got conflicting constraints where you think you've described everything, and then it says, actually, I can't resolve this equation, I don't know what to do, in which case Apple breaks something, and the results can be hilarious or not. Yes, why do it? And I think the first solution is, it's a very powerful language, Apple wants you to use it, there isn't really any alternative. We get to the exceptions later, and basically do use it. Somebody's phone goes off behind me? Okay. It is very flexible. It is improving a lot, so every time Apple announces new operating systems, new Xcode, major Xcode updates, you will find that suddenly everything gains another level of ease, and it's becoming much clearer. Do not, for the sake of your sanity, look at the early Auto Layout documentation, because a lot of people were tearing their hair out at the time. And if you set it up in Interface Builder and you don't have an overly complex layout, or you can use the visual format language, it's actually fairly straightforward once you understand what you're doing. On iOS, you basically have very little choice if you want things to keep working. And yes, you have the whole problem of screen rotation, and you really want to handle that in a sensible way. Principles of auto layout are fairly straightforward. You've got constraints, which most people know about. But the other aspect of auto layout, which is really worth pointing out, is its constraints and priorities. And if you can't do what you want to do with constraints alone, and then you turn your device or you have a different size class and everything goes wrong, you need to look at priorities and say, we do things, I want this to be squashed, I want that to expand, and I really don't want the engine to touch any of this bit. So constraint basics, you have NS layout constraint. It's fairly straightforward. You can have relations between a view and its superview, or a view and its siblings, and that's more or less it. Got a number of different kinds of constraints, and I'm going to run very quickly through all of them. You've got height and width, and they're all very well until your layout changes, and suddenly your fixed width is completely useless, because password in English, password in French, different lengths, and suddenly your layout breaks. And you do want, even if you're not thinking of localizing your app, and depending on how successful you are, you should. But even if you change your mind about what to call an interface element, that sort of thing can just lead to a lot of curses. A lot of beginner tutorials, a lot of easy stuff basically says, oh, just set the height and width of this, and you've got auto layout. Apple strongly discourages using height and width constraints, and I think it's well worth looking at the other options and just not doing this, because you'll just make more work for yourself later. So you've got the intrinsic size, which is something you calculate and you say, okay, I always want this view to have, if you have a text view, you always want it to be the width of the text, for instance. Or if you have a multi-line view, you can say, okay, I always want it to be high enough to put all of my text in. So basically you provide the calculation and then it works. If you pin the view to the super view, you can pin it to the top, trailing, leading and bottom edges. Leading and trailing is about left to right and right to left languages. So basically if you translate your interface into Arabic, if you have a layout and you specify leading and trailing, you're good, whatever your user uses. And since iPhones are becoming much more useful and much more widespread in so many places, yes, never ever use left and right, always do leading and trailing. You can center things vertically or horizontally, and then you can adjust things, line up your sibling views. So say, okay, I want the left edges or the middles or the right leading edges, middle, trailing edges to line up, and you can do the same thing vertically. You can have spacing between things, and you can basically specify, I want this thing to be exactly the same width as the other one, or the same height, or twice the height. You've got all of these things, and you can set up all of this stuff in Interface Builder. You've got Interface Builder gives you direct feedback, and you can just play around with it. You can say, okay, at this kind of constraint, you can use update frames. You can see, okay, if I say this, how does it actually come out? So even if you are going to be using code eventually, it does work well if you just play around in Interface Builder. You get the immediate visual feedback. What is my view doing? What happens if I do this? it's fairly straightforward. And again, you have several ways of setting it in Interface Builder. You can drag from an object to either the super view or sibling view. You get a little menu that says, use this one. You've got the pin menu, which just allows you to put in values and then just say, add so and so many constraints. And you've got the Resolve Auto Layouts issues menu, where you can adjust the frame of things, adjust the constraints to where you've dragged things. You can let it do stuff automatically. And I find that a lot of the time, if you let Interface Builder you put in constraints, if it's a reasonably simple layout, they're actually quite sensible constraints. So it's not actually catastrophic if you say, Interface Builder, please give me an idea what I'm doing here, and you will come out with something that's actually reasonable. That was a nice discovery, because quite often automatic tools can be a bit miss and go. So you've got the visual format language, and before you do anything in code, translates auto-sizing mask into constraints, needs to be false, otherwise things go wrong. If you set it in Interface Builder, this gets done automatically. If you do it in code, remember this. I mean, this is a setting that's harks back to the day before auto layout, when auto layout was introduced and you could do some auto layout and just leave the rest as it was. But really, this is a setting to remember, because if you forget it, things will go wrong. So 2 ways of doing it. You either tell a view directly, do this, or if you're using a custom subclass of NSView, you just override the variable and you're done. Visual format language is a fun thing. And you can do quite complex layouts and just describe them all in one go. You get multiple relationships. It's fairly human readable, so you're not going to be looking at a page of constraints and go, okay, so how does this work? What did I even mean to do here? It's fairly readable. If you want to manipulate individual constraints in code, you do need to put them in individually. So if you have a fairly static layout, VFL is the way to go. If you want it to be dynamic and you want to use disclosure and shrink things and move things around, then sadly it's not the thing. So process is fairly straightforward. You create a dictionary with the views. You create your constraints by basically just lining them up and saying this one butts up to that one, comes up to that one, and you activate them, or in older versions of the system, add them. It's now recommended that you should use the activate constraint process. So again, this is one of the things. It changes, and it's always a good idea to actually look at Apple's documentation, what the latest version is, because if you just look around, you find a tutorial, it's a couple of years old, it's really good, it's really nice, and then sooner or later you find actually you've been doing things the long way around, and you should have kept on the bleeding edge and actually looked up. Apple's documentation has the syntax, so I'm not going to run through all of these, but you can see it's fairly straightforward. You say, okay, I want to have the left edge, this item, this much space, the next item, and then the right edge. And that's your lineup, and that's your layout. And horizontal basically does the same thing and just goes from top to bottom. So you learn a couple, basically a couple of bits of vocabulary. Okay, this is how you specify a flexible layout. This is how you say they're the same width. And that's fairly straightforward. Again, it's a good, if you're not using Interface Builder, it's a good prototyping tool. You can just run things out, see how does this work, and then change it quite easily. And yes, point worth making again, Constraints are equations the system attempts to solve, which means a lot of the time it works as you intend, and some of the time it doesn't. NS layout anchor, new way of doing this, just introduced in El Capitan, and that gives you a slightly easier syntax. This is the old style syntax for NS layout constraint. And again, there's a number of things you can get wrong and you can forget, and you keep looking up, and which bit do I point to that? The layout anchor, where you just say, okay, the bottom layout anchor to the bottom layout anchor of the view, is much more straightforward syntax. So for that alone, I would recommend El Capitan and OS 9 on the other side. So yes, couple of rules to recap. Don't use height and width constraints. Don't add everything just to the super view, and add constraints to the view itself as much as you can. If things don't work out and you can't work out how to make it look as you want it, do go back and look at priorities, and don't forget them. Activate and deactivate sets of constraints. And yes, the difference between OS 10.10 and 10.11. What can go wrong? Everything. And even if you're familiar with auto layout, sooner or later you'll probably come across something and you think you've got it all, you think you've remembered everything, and it doesn't. That seemed to be one of the sort of major points for me. You've got a view that's a subview of something else, and it contains several views, and sooner or later at some point you forget to set auto layout somewhere. You don't I mean, I tend to forget scroll views in that system when I'm setting them up, and yes, the more complex things get, the worse they are. Invisible views, another fun thing. You've run everything, you've set your auto layout, you run it, and there is no view. And half the time they're somewhere off screen. More likely is that you actually haven't set all the constraints necessary, and they're rendered with a size of 0, 0, and that means you just really cannot see it. It's there, it's working as intended, it's just you didn't intend to have it no size, and you keep hunting for your non-existent view. And I find it useful to always use a custom NSView subclass and just give it an intrinsic size and a background color so I can actually find my views. Yes, ambiguous layout, you think you set everything right, you run it, and you forget something, and then next time you resize your window, you do something else, and suddenly things change. Apple does give a number of debugging tools, and again, we can't run, I'm just mentioning them, and we will put the information online, and you'll have to hunt it down and use it and look it up properly. But you can check whether a window has ambiguous layout. You can get it to actually display the constraints. You can say, these are the constraints that are the problem. And yes, similar things go for conflicting constraints. Sometimes you see something, and especially if you're setting them in different places, suddenly you're saying something should be 50 points wide and should be over 100 points wide, and yes, the system breaks something, and it might not be breaking the thing you thought of, and something will go wrong, and yes, you will usually go, oh gosh, what happened here? This is a normal part of the process of auto layout, unfortunately. That's another very useful debugging tool, which wasn't quite so straightforward to actually find. Visualize mutually exclusive constraints. And when you turn that on, you look at your window, and it basically says, well, this and that are problematic. This is where your problem lies. And then you can find out, where did you set them? Where does the problem come from? And then it's fairly straightforward to actually fix. Quick word on priorities. Default priority is 1,000. It should never go over 1,000 because you can't have more than required, but you can go as low as you want, and basically it just tells the engine how to resolve it, in what order to resolve it. Do I change this button or do I change that field? If you have something where you say, okay, it doesn't fit into a narrow layout, and the computer then goes, okay, which of these elements can we compress? If you have a layout that doesn't work, it always pays off to check the constraints and basically set some of them higher or lower and see how it works. You've got two major elements in that. You've got the constraint, well, three. You've got the constraint itself, which basically says, okay, this is the distance between view and superview, or view and sibling view. You've got content tagging, and you've got compression resistance. And yes, there are these two simple things. One says content tagging, okay, you can't, it won't expand, it will actually stay here. And you've got compression resistant. We said this is the minimum width, and no, I'm not letting it be compressed any further than this. So again, a lot of the time you need to just play with them, see what works, see what doesn't, see how your interface reacts to the changes you make, because there are no hard and fast rules, apart from you should probably always be able to read text, or at least a significant portion of the text, so don't make your text fields too small. But which of them you expand, where you want to go, that's so individual. Basically, yes, you need to play around with that. Yes, difference between OS 10.10 and 10.11. When I was writing this, I was still part of the time on 10.10 and feeling it a lot more. And whatever you do, at some point you will get unexpected behavior. You will find that things don't work as you thought they did, and I think it's just perseverance, and sometimes it just helps to delete all constraints and to start again. Couple of things that make life a lot easier, and again, this is no longer quite as horrible as it was when I first started looking at auto layout. Stack views, wonderful new invention, and every single mention I found, all the WWDC videos, every tutorial, everything went always with UI stack view, which was wonderful. And then you try to use NS stack view in Yosemite. You start setting it all out. You embed it in a stack view. You run it. You remove the intrinsic sizes. And yes, basically, it did not work as intended. It, to a great degree, did not work. El Capitan is a lot friendlier. You embed it, you run it, and it actually works as intended, and you can actually work with it a lot better. So if you're intending to use NS stack views, do work on El Capitan. It's the only way forward. Otherwise, you will just spend so much time trying to work out how things should look, and finding that you can't actually test it easily, or that you have to change it. If you're switching and targeting both systems, beware, it does cause a lot of aggravation. Stack views, on the other hand, really do make it very easy for you to keep things in the right order, and you can stack views, so you can nest them, you can add a vertical, a horizontal, and you can build fairly complex layouts fairly easily, and with a lot less hassle than if you're using pure auto layout. So that really is something you need to look at. And yes, alternative that I'm just going to mention extremely briefly. If you're doing graphics, if you're doing something that you want users to interact with, especially if it's going to be something that you want users to be able to drag around, change around. Do look at SpriteKit, which incidentally goes with frame sizes and points and does not do the whole strut and constraint dance. But I'm using SpriteKit at the moment for something that isn't a game and finding it very useful. So if you're really completely fed up with auto layout, that might be an option to consider. And that was that one. I'm hoping this was a good enough overview of auto layout and all of the points you can get to. It's a very complex thing. Once you're used to using it, most of the time it's reasonably uncomplicated and it's starting to be more straightforward. But when you're starting out, it does not feel like it at all. But there you go, it's flexible, it's nice, and when you're dealing with the whole size classes in iOS, it's the only way to go. Okay, thank you.